Alright, hi, I'm Naya, and I'm actually playing ESO again, and I'm back with another Magicka Nightblade build. This is kind of my baby, this is what I've always played. The meta has changed around, and Nightblade is in a good place. I've actually been able to have a lot of fun with it. I was able to make a build that was kind of similar to how I used to play. There are a couple changes to how I used to play 4 years ago though. For instance, I have 20 points in health, and we have quite a lot of health. This is pretty standard, it seems like. Everyone's running around with like 30k health minimum, whereas way back in ye old times it was roughly 20 to 25k health, and then slowly it kind of escalated from 25k to 30k, and then now we're at 30k to 35. It does help you not get ganked though, so that is nice. Most people are stacking spell damage and weapon damage, which is kind of what we're doing. That's part of why we can afford to have our max stats solo. It still feels really weird. When I played way back when, I never liked to have my max magic below 35k. Now here I am with not even 26k. So it feels a little weird. I'm getting used to it, but overall it has proven effective. Let's go over the food I'm using. Jewels of Misrule. I used to use Witchmother's Potent Brew, but I noticed that with how the game is right now, everything does so much damage, there's so many debuffs, I need to dodge roll more, so I finally made the switch to Jewels of Misrule, and unfortunately I do miss out on a little bit of the max magic, which does make it so I do less damage, but it's been a acceptable trade-off so far. As for my gear, I'm wearing 3-2-2 rather than the usual 5-1-1. You can do 5-1-1, but because I am a sweaty tryhard, and I need to eke out as much damage resistance as I can, I'm doing heavy on the head, chest, and legs. Each of these is reinforced. You really only need to have the chest pieces reinforced. As long as the chest piece is heavy. Never use reinforced if it's light armor or medium armor. It's not worth it. I could probably set this to well-fitted, that is the other good option, and then I still have in-pen arm crops back from when people actually wore in-pen, but it seems like no one really wears in-pen, and I will get into some of that later. As you see, we got Rallying Cry and Nightmother's Gaze. Now, Nightmother used to apply a unique penetration effect to your target. It's kind of interesting for me to come back to the game and see that it now applies Major Breach. However, that makes it so I don't have to run anything on my bars that's granting Major Breach. I don't need to use Ellie Drain, I don't need to use Elemental Susceptibility, I don't even need to use fucking Piercing Mark, which is such a weird skill. So that's nice. And it provides a lot of crit, and since crit is apparently meta in PvP, because as I mentioned, not that many people are wearing in-pen anymore, everyone's using crit. I'm using crit. I'm even using the Shadow Mundus, because that is more crit damage. If you are running in a group, or you do want to put something on your bar that gives you Major Breach, you can drop Nightmother's Gaze and use something like War Maidens, or War Maiden is a personal favorite, but you could also use that Gourmand set, Back Alley Gourmand, but that is not craftable, and so you would have to kind of do 5-1-1. You wouldn't be able to customize your armor weight, and so you could do Order's Wrath instead, which is craftable, and that would let you to customize your armor weight. Overall, you don't need a mythic to do this build. You can go without it. It's just not going to be quite as effective, because this mythic essentially grants us a free 200 extra damage stat, as well as 2,000 extra armor. It's free. There's basically no reason not to use this if you have it. It's kind of annoying to get, so I understand if you don't have it, if you don't want to get it, you don't want to deal with that shit. I didn't want to deal with it either, but I'm a sweaty tryhard, so I eventually just succumbed and got it. We're doing Rallying Cry on our back bar. It's going to proc back there, that's where most of our heals are. And then we're using a Inferno Staff on our front bar. That's right, I'm doing Destro Resto. A lot of people seem to be doing Ice Staff on back bar and dual wield on front bar. If you're doing dual wield, I definitely suggest doing Ice Staff on your back bar, because that's just going to give you more mitigation, more sustain for blocking. That's fine. But because I tend to do more of like mid-ranged brawler, I have a tendency to get into people's face despite the fact that I'm using a staff and I'm using a ranged spammable. I do get in people's face, so the Swallow Soul works. But if you're doing concealed spammable is, it's a better spammable. It does more damage, but it also costs less. So you don't need to worry about doing heavy attacks, but because this build does kind of have to do a few heavy attacks, I can go to my back bar, which is a Restoration Staff, and do heavy attacks. The passives from Restoration Staff, as well as heavy armor, allow me to run with lower sustain, because I can just do a heavy attack to get all my magic back. I do feel it sometimes, and if I'm doing a duel, I will typically want to switch out either Phantasmal Escape or like Camouflage Hunter, for instance, for siphoning attacks to kind of help with that Magicka sustain, but it's not required. And in most open world scenarios, I don't use it at all. Phantasmal Escape is just better. I don't have space on my bar for sustain skill, so I don't use it. If you do the Maker or Markin ring, you want to do one piece of Trainee, or I think Druid's Braid is the name of the set that'll give you a 1-piece bonus. This is honestly really nice. Like, even if I wasn't using the Mythic, this would be really nice because of that, just, it's free extra max health. Why not? And since everyone is building into max health, it's kind of nice to have max health with actually having to put points into max health so I can have more points into my damage stat. My stamina is increased by the fact that I am a Dunmer. I've always kind of had a mixed feeling between like max stats versus regen. The fact that I have stamina regen is kind of just enough for me, at least back when we weren't using Resolving Vigor because it did not scale properly. There was no hybrid stuff. So having the max stamina from Dunmer was helpful, and I definitely felt its help, but it wasn't something that I felt was mandatory. I would just prefer to have 1 piece of stamina regen rather than having like food that gives me max stam. But now I'm having max stam and a little bit of stam regen, and it's honestly fucking wonderful. I love it. As for monster set, you can kind of change things around, but I use Balrog. I will talk about alternate stuff to use for all of this really later. Let's get into the skills. I'll do a breakdown of them. Merciless Resolve. This is your main burst ability. It gives you spell damage for every light attack you do, or spell and weapon damage. So one thing that I suggest doing is when you're going to apply your dot, Debilitate, we'll get into this later, but when you're going to apply that dot, try to have at least 2 stacks of Merciless, if not 5 or 3 or 4, before casting this, because unless they changed it, the term for it in World of Warcraft was called snapshotting, I think. It will kind of snapshot your weapon damage stat when you cast your dot. So having this giving you extra stats, and then you use this, means that you're going to get a little bit of extra damage out of this ability over time, even after you spend Merciless and lose that weapon damage. Same thing applies for having your weapon damage enchantment on your back bar proc. If you proc that and then have full stacks of Merciless and then use your dot, that is how you're going to get the most effectiveness out of your dot. The dot doesn't really do that much. It applies a little bit of pressure, but I mostly use it for sustain. I will get into that in a bit. So another thing to note about Merciless, if you're in melee range, and I know I'm doing a mostly ranged build, but as I mentioned, I have a tendency to get in people's face regardless of the fact that I am very ranged oriented. So I do occasionally benefit from the Merciless heal. This heal, however, does double dip. It says that I would hit for 15k, but because of Battle Spirit, that's going to be reduced by 50%, and then, of course, by the resistances the person has. But let's pretend the person is naked and doesn't have any resistances, and so this is just going to hit for 15k. It's going to hit for true damage, essentially what it is on the tooltip. So that's going to get cut in half by 50%, and then the heal that comes from it is going to get cut in half again, because this ability's healing does double dip. So even though I may hit a person for roughly 7k magic damage, I'm only going to get like a 2, 3, 4k heal. And that is assuming that I even hit them for like the full damage. Most of the time, my Merciless will hit for, at least on a non-crit, I've seen it hit for like 9 or 8k, which means that if I was in melee range, I would probably only get like 2 to 3k healing back. Overall, that is a pretty reasonable amount to assume, because this ability does double dip. Now, this ability does not double dip. Swallow Soul. It's not the best spammable, but it does damage and it keeps my health up. I find this is really great because sometimes I get really tunnel focused and I forget to, recast Vigor or recast Path, but just having this little heal over time effect really helps keep my health up, and it allows me to not worry about dots as much. I can have a couple dots on me and not worry about it too much, but if I was playing melee, I would definitely be worrying about it, because the only heal over time effect I have is Refreshing Path, and that's not going to be enough to outpace the damage that dots are doing on me. So this is going to heal us 38% of the damage done. This is just my tooltip. The percentage will change, but it's usually about 1/3 of the damage that you do with Strife. So Swallow Soul, Strife are the same thing. Strife is the unmorphed version. Swallow Soul is going to hit a target for 7k. Now, if it did the double dipping thing, that it would only heal us for maybe like 500 every 2 seconds. But because it doesn't double dip, this is going to hit an enemy for, say, 2,000. And we are going to get about a little less than 1,000 healing, you know, maybe like 7,000 every 2 seconds, rather than if that were to also be reduced in half. So thankfully, this does not double dip as much, and it actually is not like inconsiderable healing. It's definitely not going to carry your ass, but it is going to help you not dip super low and allow you to keep giving offensive pressure, because it's going to heal you every time you use it. Yeah, that's right, it heals you for a little bit every time you use it. If your enemy dodges this, it is kind of annoying. Same thing with Merciless, you don't get the heal from Merciless if they dodge, which is kind of annoying. That's why we have our other abilities to make sure our healing doesn't get dodged. Now, I'm actually going to talk about Shadow Image later, so we're going to skip across this for now. Camouflage Hunter, this is a great skill just because you get the Berserk. The crit is also nice. I just use PvE spell power potions, so I have crit on my back bar as well, but then I also have crit on my front bar with this. I actually find that this is really helpful for Nightblade, Magicka Nightblade in particular, because we have a class passive that will give us Minor Savagery, which increases our weapon critical. If I'm just drinking PvE spell power potions, it's not going to increase my weapon critical, it's only going to increase my spell crit. So, you know, spell power potions aside, having this will bring my crit to even numbers. So let's drink a potion and look at our crit. Spell crit, 38%. 38%. If I take this off, 38%, 26%. The game takes whichever of these numbers is higher. So having Expert Hunter, or Camouflage Hunter in this case, on your bar will make sure that your game takes the highest number, which after you do critical damage, you'll have extra crit, weapon crit specifically, for a certain amount of time. So even though we're playing Magicka Nightblade, we can still benefit from the hemorrhage ability. On our back bar, it doesn't really benefit us. We're going to be stuck with the slightly lower amount, but the hemorrhage ability this here will give us about like 5% extra crit, so I usually get to like, you know, 44% crit chance, and that will apply to healing as well. However, when I go to my back bar, I then lose the weapon damage effect from this, and I'm just, you know, with this, with the spell damage crit, which is like 38%, so that's not as high of a percentage for heals, but I mean, it's better than nothing, especially if I go from Vigor to my front bar. I believe it updates to the crit on your front bar, and so that you will have increased crit chance there. Debilitate. I am using this mostly as a sustainability because it gives Minor Magicka Steal. Minor Magicka Steal used to be like almost mandatory for a lot of builds. I believe it's like, we do the quick math real quick. You restore 100, we're gonna simplify and just say 150 Magicka every 1 second. I'm rounding down when damaging a target. Because this is a dot, it's always going to be damaging your target, like every, what, 2 seconds, I think? So even if you miss an attack, like if they dodge, there is a chance that you will still get the tick of resources back. So regen is every 2 seconds. So this equates to basically almost 300 Magicka regen. However, it doesn't get affected by drinking a potion, which will give you the minor intellect, you know, increasing your recovery. So it is essentially like a static recovery that isn't affected by any buffs, but it also is just a consistent free 300 extra Magicka recovery, give or take. I don't use siphoning attacks because I can use this ability. I have considered using siphoning attacks. In fact, on duels, I'll actually put this on my back bar in place of Phantasmal Escape, unless I'm fighting a Templar or a Warden or even a Necromancer, really. But, you know, putting that on your back bar helps you sustain, great in duels. You can also take Camouflage Hunter out and put Mass Hysteria on. If you're doing a duel, you'll miss out on the crit thing that I just told you about, but sometimes that's worth it for the extra CC, but also the Major Cowardice that is applied for 12 seconds. That reduces their weapon and spell damage by 430. That's more than Power Extraction reduces it. Unfortunately, it does not give us any of that stats like Power Extraction, but it's still not an inconsiderable amount. This is a great ability because it goes through block. However, it's also kind of a shit ability because it only has 6 meter radius. It's really hard to land sometimes because of how everyone is kind of zooming around the battlefield with Major, Minor Expedition, or Swift Jewelry. It can be kind of hard to land this because it only has a 6 meter radius. I honestly think it needs to be 7 meters at the very least, because even in this upcoming patch, melee abilities are going to be increased to 7 meters as a standard just to make melee abilities easier to land. And honestly, thank God, if I ever play melee Magblade, which I do on occasions, you know, just dabble in it, it's really hard to land hits sometimes because everyone's just zooming past each other. It feels like you're jousting almost. So this probably needs a bit of an increase in range. In a duel though, when you're not zooming quite as much, this is still pretty helpful. So definitely use this in a duel. When I need a stun in open world, I usually just rely on Incap or Soul Tether. Now, I talked about Debilitate being a sustain ability. It also helps apply some consistent pressure, so if I'm not constantly damaging an enemy, this will help me constantly damage them. Speaking of pressure, that's the reason that I use Destruction Staff rather than Dual Wield. Because Dual Wield light attacks can be kind of hard to hit, they don't really do as much damage. Oftentimes after I go through a fight and I pull up, let's see, CMX, it's not uncommon for me to see Infernal light attacks being the majority of my DPS, even on longer drawn-out duels where I'm using bunch of different abilities. Infernal light attacks are pretty consistently at the top. Sometimes if I'm using dual wield, they'll either be at the top, but not quite as much of a percentage of my DPS, or they'll be like right underneath the thing that's at the top, which is often like concealed or merciless or something like that. So that is something to consider. That's probably why I find Inferno Staff to be so effective, is the consistent pressure that I can apply even at range, which also allows me to use more Merciless because, you know, I can charge it at range too. I like using a staff. It's helpful. So, about pressure, this will help apply a little bit of pressure. The damage from this skill is honestly not that great, so it's not that important in terms of like adding a little pressure, but think about it. If your enemy has small passive health regen and they dodge for a few seconds, they're just gaining health and you're not doing any damage. You're not reducing their healing done. You know, maybe they don't cast Vigor, but you know, they do dodge and they do have some passive health regen from some ability or just native health regen. They're gonna heal and you're not gonna do any damage. So to help mitigate that, you can put a dot on them, even just one dot, and that'll help kind of reduce the passive healing that they do. I honestly find that one of the reasons I like using Swallow is because I'll have like a Dragon Knight put like fucking 3 different dots on me. You know, Burning Embers, Noxious Breath, Master Dual Wield, and maybe even Spiked Armor, which doesn't hit for that much, but it is another dot. And, you know, you just melt. But with Swallow Soul and Refreshing Path, you're not melting quite as much, and it kind of helps you not get absolutely just melted into a puddle. Moving on to our back bar, we have Cloak. I will talk about this a little bit more later. Going on, we have Phantasmal Escape. This will give you major evasion, reducing damage you take from area attacks by 20% for 12 seconds. This is an essential 1vx skill because people are going to leap on you, they're going to use Blast Bones, they're going to use all different sorts of AoE abilities that are kind of just what they use, you know? Blast Bones is an AoE ability, but it is technically their Necromancer's Burst as well. Same thing with Shulks. This will allow you to take less damage from Shulks. It'll also allow you to take less damage from Templars and Dawnbreakers. What do most classes use out there to burst you down? Dawnbreaker, Leap, Shulks. Those are some of the like big things that people use to burst you down, and then Spin to Win too. So this will help you not die from stuff like that, and even better, it gives you snare immunity for 4 seconds. Because of how fast everyone is, I don't find the snare immunity to be quite as impactful as it used to be, but it's still noticeable. Another really awesome part of this skill is that when you take direct damage, it reduces the cost of your next dodge roll, and since we're a Magicka build, reducing the net cost of our next dodge roll is pretty fucking nice, you know? That's sweet. Moving on, we have Resolving Vigor. This is kind of like a mandatory PvP skill. I really miss the days where you could like cross-heal your friends with this, even if it did less healing for them, because it would do like, I believe the tooltip was roughly similar to what it is now, but it did increase healing on yourself. So your tooltip would be 15k healing over 5 seconds, whereas what they would get is 10k healing over 5 seconds. This would be great because it would allow me to proc Transmutation, which is a set that I occasionally use, but it doesn't let me do that. So the only thing I have to proc Transmutation right now is Refreshing Path, which is still pretty good. But the main reason that we want Resolving Vigor isn't just because it heals us for more, but it's because it gives us Minor Resolve, which increases our spell resistance and our physical resistance. One of the reasons that I actually use 3 pieces of heavy armor instead of just 1 or even 2 is because of the Shadow Barrier passive. It's going to give us our our resistances for longer. Casting and Shadow ability grants you major resolve for 6 seconds, increasing your physical and spell resistance by 6,000 roughly. This duration is increased by 25% for each piece of heavy armor equipped. If I only have one piece of heavy armor, this lasts for like 6 or 7 seconds. This used to only last for like 3 seconds, so I think they buffed it. Now with a couple pieces of heavy armor on, it lasts for about 10 seconds, which gives me some time to not worry about it quite as much. So I can cast Shade, I cast Vigor, and on our back bar, which is defending, we're basically hitting the resistance cap, which I think is 32, maybe it's 36, but I'm pretty sure it's 32. On our front bar, it's slightly less. You can also reactivate Shade to get the resistance proc, and you know, it's a little bit less than max resistances, but that's still a lot of resistances. Mark here is also contributing to this, so you know, I am a tanky motherfucker. Not just because of crit resist, but also just normal native resistances. So moving on, Healthy Offering. I experimented between the different morphs. Healthy Offering is just better. The minor mending it gives is very vital in PvP, and it's a burst heal. It says, oh, it drains health from you over 3 seconds. It used to be an upfront cost, and it was fucking atrocious. Magicka did not have a burst heal for a while, and it was a really dark time because we used to use Healing Ward as our burst heal. Because it would, not only would it give you a small damage shield, but it would also heal on cast. And when they removed that, the heal on cast, it just fucking tanked Magicka Nightblade for a long time. It was still pretty good at doing damage, but it struggled to, you know, not die. So having Healthy Offering being a viable option is wonderful. I have only killed myself with it once. Unfortunately, I did not get the AP for the kill. I feel like I should have gotten it because Healthy Offering is what dealt the killing blow, but hey, can't all be winners. So for the most part, the 1000 health drain is, it is something, but it's not really that big of a deal when you're healing for 11k health. Or I guess in PvP you're gonna be here. What are we gonna hit for? 5k, give or take. That's almost 6k, and that's non-crit. So that 1000 health draining over a few seconds is kind of a small price to pay, but it is a price to pay. So it's not something you should just be like, oh, I can just spam this with wistful abandon or whatever it is. You probably shouldn't be spamming your burst heal anyways unless you're like really under pressure. I would only cast this, Vigor, and then go back to being on offense as you want to apply counter pressure. So yeah. Going on Refreshing Path, this is the ability that made me fall in love with Magicka Nightblade, but back then it did damage. I actually used this to pull people out of Cloak rather than, you know, nowadays I use Expert Hunter, but I used this to pull people out of Cloak because it did damage. Now it just does healing, but the Expedition and the Sustain passive that it grants is quite helpful. I believe it almost always, yeah, it always granted Expedition, so it was nice for that and it was nice for the healing, but it seems like they buffed it so that it also gives you recovery, which is quite nice. So when I have all my recovery buffs active, oh, I'm missing my food. There we go. This is what our recovery looks like. We have off resource recovery and Magicka recovery. If I could, I'd love to get this a little higher, but I'm quite content with what we have. And part of the reason that I use Restoration Staff is because I can sustain through heavy attacks on my Resto Staff, rather than using a Ice Staff, which I don't get to sustain that much with. Soul Tether, so you could use Dawnbreaker in place of this. If you're looking to get the most healing out of your back bar, I tried it out and I'm pretty sure Soul Tether gives you more healing. Now you might think that, well hey, Fighter's Guild gives you extra damage stats, which does affect your healing. So you could also have Dawnbreaker on your back bar. And yes, you're absolutely right, you could have Dawnbreaker on your back bar and it would increase your healing. However, you also have to consider the Siphoning passive, which gives you 3% extra healing with each siphoning ability you have on your back bar. And with this setup, we have 2 siphoning abilities on our back bar, so that's 6% extra healing. If we lose one of them, then we get spell damage, but we lose the healing stat. And I believe the healing stat is actually better than the spell damage. So we're going to be eking out a little bit more healing with Soul Tether on our back bar. They both act as AoE stuns and AoE nukes, and you can still do group play with both of them. So I've just decided to use Soul Tether on my back bar. It's only a little bit more expensive, and Magicka Nightblade generates ultimate really quickly. So yeah, now talking about these two abilities, Cloak and Shadow Image. Cloak is a very controversial ability. Everyone hates it or they love it or whatever. I have a love-hate relationship with it. For the longest time I've had a love-hate relationship with Shade too, and there's still little bits about it that really irk me, because the duration is only 22 seconds. I find that sometimes the duration is not enough. By the time I run away a suitable distance and I'm like, oh, I need to shade back, I'm either, well, look at this. I cannot shade back, I'm out of range. And so I just end up placing it again, and I have to try it all over again. So, you know, if I'm fighting, running around, sometimes it would also just time out. So the duration could be longer, and the teleport range could be a bit longer. It doesn't need to be that much longer, but it is a little short, so you do have to pay attention. Now, this ability here is why I don't recommend using Vampire, because Vampire will increase your the cost of all your abilities, and most people only use it for Undeath passive, which is admittedly really good, but they also use it for Elusive Mist. Elusive Mist is definitely more user-friendly, it's less clunky, and it requires less thought ahead of time, but after you kind of get the hang of using Shade, you never live without it. This is the ability that gives us the 1vx and outplay potential. I can even use it in more simpler ways, like, let's say I'm fighting a guy just like this. You know, he's standing right there, I'm standing right here, and we're like, doop-de-doo. I can Shade, do a light attack behind him at his flank, and that will instantly proc Camouflage Hunter. In most cases. We also have a bonus for, you know, a penetration bonus when we're flanking a target. So it's quite nice. You can even just use it in your usual play, and it will also update your penetration or your resistances. So not something to sleep on at all. The only thing that I would ever actually really miss from Vampire is the extra damage you get when you leave stealth. That synergizes really well with Nightblade, but because the extra cost, and I'm already running a tight ship when it comes to sustain, I cannot justify using it. And furthermore, what's the most dominant class out there right now in PvP? Fucking Magicka Dragonite. And they used a lot of fire damage, so probably best to just avoid anything that makes you take extra fire damage. Even as a Dunmer, I feel like it's just a lot, so best to just avoid Vampire. You could use Vampire as kind of like training wheels, you know, maybe you're not very good with Shade and you need Mist, go for it, I won't stop you, but you can play well without it, and I highly recommend it. As for Cloak, if you're in a duel, don't use Cloak. Not only is it fucking annoying, it's unnecessary in most cases. A lot of the time, if I'm using Cloak and I'm fighting, I break Cloak early. I will sit in Cloak, I will like walk a little, and then I'll break it early by casting a healing ability. Cloak is essentially Magicka Dodge. It used to suppress dots, and I do think it probably should. Again, I'm kind of on the fence about that, because Cloak is very powerful, but it does have a lot of counters, including Detect Pots, which I could make a whole video about that. I'm not getting into Detect Pots, but Cloak has a lot of counters, and so having it suppress dots was great. It meant that I wasn't totally fucked, but now I go into Cloak, and I can't cast healing abilities or else the Zerg over there is gonna see me, so I just have to hope I don't die from dots, or I just have to, you know, cast a healing ability and then go back into Cloak, which is just burning even more resources. Don't use Cloak in a 1v1, not only is it annoying, it's just not that effective. The only reason you should use Cloak in a duel is to relieve pressure and Magicka Dodge. It forces single target abilities that are cast at you to miss. So, it's essentially Magicka Dodge. It's not perfect, and it doesn't, you know, move you around like Dodge does, but it is pretty useful. So, make sure that you're not just spamming Cloak to get around. Another thing, if you're trying to get away from a bunch of people coming at you, what I recommend is, let's say they're coming at me from this path, this direction right here. You put Shade down. Oh god, they're coming at me. Run away. Run this way. So they think you're going this way. And then Shade and quickly Cloak, so that they're chasing you in that direction, but you went the opposite direction. Another thing you can do, and this really only works in smaller groups that aren't spamming a shit ton of AoEs, is you can go through the group. As they come through this choke point, I can hit Cloak and I can go through them, because they're not going to turn around and look at the direction they just went. They are always going to go in the opposite direction. So I could direct them in the opposite direction, or I could just go through them. Going through them is definitely more risky, but it works. When it works, it fucking works. So that is something to consider. As for using path, if you can, fight on your path. It's usually better to kind of stay in your path. You know, you can go out of it and go back into it. Path is kind of expensive, so don't spam it that much, but you can definitely make do with casting it again a couple times. As for potions, I mentioned I'm using PvE spell power potions, so you don't need to worry about using fancy potions. You could use immovables. I do have detect potions on because it's mid-year mayhem, and there's a lot of gankers out there, and I don't like gankers. So, detect pots. But yeah, as for alternate gear sets, I've mentioned, I've mentioned and showed my gear setup. You could also use Bloodspawn in place of Balrogs, and I have actually used Grothdar. This used to do more damage. Well, actually, I'm pretty sure it did the same amount of damage, but because people had less health, this was more effective. So, it's not really that effective to use anymore, but it helps get people off my ass. Because of the, flaming circle that appears at my feet, it makes people not want to get in my face, and so I almost end up chasing them with Grothdar. It's kind of funny. Like, even if they're still attacking me, they're usually backpedaling. So, Grothdar is useful not just for the damage that it does, but also to kind of chase people away. I think you should at least try it, even if you don't end up using it as like your standard set. Hell, even I don't use it as my standard set anymore. I use Balrog, but I think you should at least try it just to see, because it's kind of funny to like chase people with this ring of fire around your legs. Bloodspawn is also a great defensive option, but I just feel like I lack the damage with Bloodspawn, even though I do get more ultimate generation. So Balrog is honestly just the way to go. There's no reason to not use Balrog. You could try using a sustain set if you want, but we have enough sustain, at least if you're doing it properly. Now, as for the races, I would say that you could do any race with this build, like my beloved Bosmer. I love Bosmer, but with the hybrid meta, it's kind of hard to play a Bosmer. So, unfortunately, you probably want to stick to a class or a race that will benefit in this some way. That is basically anything that isn't a Redguard and Orc, I think. I think Orcs are mostly stamina focused. Redguard, Orc, and Bosmer. Almost any other race will benefit this playstyle and this build more directly. I'm using Dunmer because long ago when I first started playing ESO, I did a little bit of roleplay, and Morrowind is cool, so I played a Dunmer. And I like my Dunmer. I think she's pretty, and she has decent stats, The resistance to fire is nice. The fact that we get extra max magic and max stamina is nice. And then we get extra weapon and spell damage. That's great. You could also play an Altmer, because you will get more damage and sustain out of an Altmer. Actually, you'll get roughly the same damage, but you'll get better sustain out of an Altmer. And you could play a Breton. That's my other recommendation, is playing a Breton, because you get so much fucking Magicka sustain. If you play a Breton, you'll see that I'm using an infused Magicka recovery glyph. You don't need that if you're playing Breton. You can just do full spell damage. You don't need it. Definitely try using Swift, and definitely try using infused. I'm probably going to change this Bloodthirsty, but it works because I don't use an Execute. So other than that, I think I mentioned using Well-Fitted and Reinforced and all that wonderful stuff. I use Sharpened on my front bar. You can use Defending on your back bar. Probably should use Powered on your back bar, but I'm still using Defending because that's just what I have on hand. So that is something to consider. Overall, I think that more or less covers it. Let's look at champion points, and then I think that will be it. So champion points, I have Duelist Rebuff. This is pretty standard. The Warfare points are pretty standard. I have single target and direct damage increase, and then single target and direct damage taken decrease. That's pretty standard in PvP. This is just, do whatever you want. Gifted Rider is definitely great for Cyrodiil, and the Steed's Blessing is also really nice. As for fitness, you probably want to go with some of the more standard stuff. Pain's Refuge, I'd say, is required for PvP. Relentless is optional, but I like it because this game is a little wonky sometimes, so when you break free, you don't always break free. So having this 10% less damage taken for 3 seconds after you get CC'd is quite nice, because when you get CC'd, people might be going for the kill. This will save your ass, but Major Protection used to be like 30% damage reduction, and now it's only 10%, so it's probably not as worth it. And if you're really good at breaking free, definitely switch this out for either like more max health or Sustained by Suffering, which reduces like the cost of dodge roll and all that while you have an effect on you. So I wouldn't worry about that too much. Fortified, you could also do Healthy, or whatever gives you health, but Fortified is what I'm using because armor is nice. And Rejuvenation. I mostly like this not just because it gives me sustain for my main stat, but because it gives me sustain for my off stat as well. So it kind of helps keep my stamina up, even without Jewels of Misrule. It's quite nice. I believe that covers everything. We're using the Shadow. You could also use the other skill, the Apprentice, whatever gives you spell damage. I would not use any other than spell damage or the shadow. I don't think I mentioned incap. One of the reasons I used incap rather than like Dawnbreaker, for instance, is because of the sustain passive it gives. It gives you sustain for your main and off resource, so it's definitely something you want to have on your front bar rather than on your back bar per se. But I think that's something that most people are going to do, and I don't have to say it, but I'm saying it just in case. Even if I haven't covered it, it's definitely here on the screen right now. Just pause it, take a look at it. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or even suggestions, feel free to leave in the comments. I tend to look at all of them because I don't get that many people commenting, so I definitely have time to answer comments. If you have a question, I highly encourage you to just ask that question, because that is how you learn things. Good luck out there. I hope you have a good time. Try the build out. Tell me what you think. Have a great day.